Let's pull up a map, specifically a map of Africa. If you put it side by side with a map of Europe, something immediately looks off. European borders are squiggly. They follow rivers. They go over mountain ranges. You can literally see the traces of hundreds of years of history and slow shifts right there on the lines. But African borders, they're different. They're straight, way too straight in way too many places. They look like someone drew them with a ruler. And, actually, someone did draw them with a ruler. These straight lines, they are the starting point of our story today. November 1884. Berlin, Germany. As the Ottoman Empire was declining, the European powers were already eyeing a new prize Africa. From that November until February of the following year, representatives from 14 European nations gathered in Berlin. They were there to solve one problem. How are we going to carve up Africa? A massive map of Africa was rolled out in the conference room. The British rep drew a line with a pencil. The French rep drew another line. The reps from Germany, Portugal, and Belgium all took turns drawing their lines. And inside that room, there wasn't a single African. Not even one. Most of these guys had never even set foot in Africa. Who lived under those lines? What languages they spoke? Where one tribe ended and another began? They couldn't care less. They just drew lines, with a ruler and a pencil. History calls this the Berlin Conference. And this whole process is known as the Scramble for Africa. Let me give you a few examples of just how absurdly these lines were drawn. Ever heard of a country called the Gambia? It's in West Africa, and its shape is incredibly bizarre. It looks like a long, thin stick at its widest. It's only about 50 kilometers across, but it's over 300 kilometers long. Why does it look like that? Because the British just drew a line along the Gambia River, a little bit of land on either side of the water. That became the Gambia. France took all the surrounding land, which became Senegal. So, the Gambia is completely surrounded by Senegal. It's literally jammed right into Senegalese territory. People who historically belonged to the same ethnic group and the same culture were split into completely different countries just because of that one line. But that's nothing. Let's look at Nigeria. It's the most populous country in Africa, with over 200 million people. But inside this one country, there are over 250 different ethnic groups. In the north, you have the predominantly Muslim Hausa and Fulani. In the southwest, the largely Christian Yoruba. In the southeast, the Igbo. For centuries, these people lived in completely separate kingdoms. They spoke different languages, practiced different religions, and had entirely different histories. But when Britain drew its lines, it forced all of them into a single country. Even the name Nigeria was coined by a British journalist, Flora Shaw, in 1897. It just means the area around the Niger River. Before that, the very concept of Nigeria didn't exist. People were just members of their own tribes or kingdoms, not Nigerian. Now, here's the core question. Why does this connect to the conflicts we see today? A nation isn't just a line on a map. For a country to actually function, the people inside it need at least a baseline sense of community. A feeling of, hey, we are the same people. That feeling is built by living together over a long period of time. Shared history, shared language, shared memories. That's how national identity is formed. But the lines drawn in Berlin completely ignored all of that. They crammed hostile tribes who had been fighting for centuries into the same country, and they ripped single ethnic groups apart into two. As a result, even after independence, many African nations couldn't build a national identity. They became countries without a unified people. And democracy is incredibly hard to run in a country without a unified people. Just having an election doesn't mean you have a democracy. Even when they vote, people don't vote as citizens of a nation. They vote along tribal lines. If my tribe takes power, The power isn't used for the whole country. It's used strictly for my tribe. The other tribes get marginalized. That exclusion turns into anger. And that anger erupts into civil war. You know about the Rwandan Genocide, right? In 1994, over the course of just 100 days, roughly 800,000 people were slaughtered. It was the Hutus killing the Tutsis, but the conflict between these two groups was largely manufactured by Belgium during the colonial era. While ruling Rwanda, the Belgians set up an administrative system that favored the Tutsis and discriminated against the Hutus. It was the classic colonial strategy of divide and conquer. Even after Belgium left, that fracture remained. 30 years later, that crack exploded into a genocide. Alright, now let's talk about foreign aid. After World War II, African nations started gaining independence one by one. But the joy of independence was brief. Poverty, civil war, and dictatorship followed. So the Western world came up with an answer for foreign aid. Do you know the total amount of official development assistance ODA put into Africa from the 1960s to today? Trillions of dollars. Literally, trillions. With that money, they built schools, they built hospitals, paved roads, dug wells, taught agricultural techniques, and yet, the conflicts didn't stop. The poverty didn't go away. Dictators kept popping up. Why? Dambi Samiu, an economist from Zambia, wrote a book tackling this exact question head-on. Her argument isn't simple, but here's the gist. The aid actually cemented the problems. Think about it. A government receiving massive foreign aid doesn't need to collect taxes from its citizens to run the country. The money is just flowing in from the outside. So their incentive to actually treat their people well, it vanishes. They don't need the public support to survive. They just need the foreign aid. You know what the most powerful engine of democracy is? Taxpayer anger. Where are you spending my tax money? That question is what keeps governments on their toes. But in an aid-dependent country, that engine is dead. In a way, foreign aid has actually stunted the growth of democracy. Now, obviously, not all aid is bad. When it comes to emergency relief, medical support, and disaster response, aid has genuinely saved countless lives. You can't deny that. But when it comes to solving structural poverty, the endless cycle of conflict, and failed states, aid just hasn't been as effective as we thought. In fact, sometimes it backfired. Because the real problem was never a lack of money. The real problem is the borders. Those straight lines. If you force people who can't form a cohesive nation into one box, no amount of money you pour in will make that country function properly. It's like a house. If the foundation is botched, it doesn't matter how nice the furniture is that you bring in. The house is literally tilting, but we're just sitting there swapping out the couches. The foundation is flawed. The borders are flawed. And that flawed foundation started with those lines drawn by Europeans in a Berlin conference room in 1884. But that brings up another uncomfortable question. Why not just redraw the lines? Realistically, it's impossible, because for decades now, these countries have been operating based on those exact lines. If you try to redraw the borders now, it just sparks another war. It's not like people haven't tried. Eritrea gained independence from Ethiopia. South Sudan gained independence from Sudan. But what happened after? South Sudan erupted into civil war. Less than 2 years after it became a country, they made a new country. But inside it, there were still competing tribes. Redrawing the lines doesn't fix it, because the ethnic distribution in Africa is so incredibly complex that no matter where you draw the line, someone is going to end up on the wrong side. This is the curse of the straight line. Once a line is drawn wrong, even erasing it doesn't lift the curse. I want to bring up something a bit more personal here. 2015. A refugee boat capsized in the Mediterranean. A 3-year-old boy named Alan Kurdi was found washed up face down on a Turkish beach. I'm sure some of you remember that photo. It shocked the entire world. That boy's family came from Syria. Syria, look at this country, too, in 1916, right in the middle of World War I. Britain and France made a secret agreement on how to carve up the Middle East. It's called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. A British diplomat named Marx Sykes literally drew a line on a map. That line became the modern borders of Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. And just like in Africa, that line completely ignored the ethnic makeup and history of the people living there. Shia, Sunni, Kurds, Halite, all violently shoved into one country. A century later, the civil war created by that very line is what threw a 3-year-old boy into the ocean. The curse of the straight line isn't just an African story. So how are we supposed to look at all this? When we see news about conflicts in Africa or the Middle East, our first thought is usually, why do they fight so much? Why can't they just unite? Why can't they develop? But we've got the order of the questions all wrong. What we should be asking is this. Why were they forced to build an impossible nation in the first place? A nation should be built because the people want it to be built, based on shared history and shared will. Like how so many African countries, that wasn't the case. They were trapped inside lines drawn by Europeans for European convenience, and then basically told to play country. Faced with that impossible task, these countries have actually held on remarkably well. Saying they held on might sound like a backhanded compliment, but it's not. These are people who were handed the wrong blueprints, yet somehow managed to keep the house standing for 140 years. Let's wrap this up. It's been 140 years since the Berlin Conference. The diplomats who drew those lines in that room are long dead. The colonial empires that carved up the land are gone, but the lines are still alive. Right at this very moment, they are still right there on the map. People are living inside those lines. People are fighting because of those lines. And people are fleeing across those lines. Grenade keeps pouring in. The goodwill is real. The intentions are genuine. But as long as those lines remain, that goodwill is just going to keep crashing into a brick wall of structural problems. Geography isn't neutral. A map isn't just a picture on a piece of paper. In every single one of those lines, someone's destiny is trapped. Someone's life, their choices, their potential, and the men who drew those lines. Did they know that when they drew them, or did they just not care? Whatever the answer is, the result is the exact same. The lines were drawn, and the curse began, and it still isn't over.